The storm's fury. The wind howled a banshee's song, clawing at the eaves of the ranch house. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, turning the yard into a muddy swamp. Dusty Rivers watched it all from his window, a knot tightening in his gut. This wasn't just another prairie squall. This was a storm with teeth. He'd battened down the hatches hours ago, securing the livestock in the stable, bringing in anything that might blow away. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait it out, a solitary sentinel against the raging elements. The power lines had snapped an hour back, plunging the house into darkness, punctuated only by the flashes of lightning that ripped across the sky. Dusty poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the pot he'd made earlier, the bitter liquid doing little to ease the growing unease within him. He was used to solitude, even craved it most days. But tonight, the isolation felt like a weight, pressing down on him with the force of the storm itself. A sudden, sharp crack of thunder rattled the windows, and the house seemed to shudder. Dusty jumped, sloshing coffee onto his calloused hand. He swore under his breath, wiping the spill with a rag. As he did, he heard it, a faint sound, almost swallowed by the wind's fury. A whimper. He froze, listening intently. There was again a soft, pain sound that seemed to be coming from the direction of the barn. His heart hammered against his ribs. Coyotes didn't whimper, and there were no other ranches within miles. He grabbed his rifle from the corner, the cold steel a small comfort in the darkness. He lit a lantern, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He moved cautiously towards the back door, pulling on his oilskin coat and wide-brimmed hat. Stepping out into the storm was like entering a different world. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the lantern from his grasp. The rain stung his face like tiny needles, blurring his vision. He lowered his head and trudged towards the barn, the mud sucking at his boots with each step. The barn door groaned open as he wrestled with the latch, the wind pushing against him with relentless force. He stepped inside, the relative shelter offering a slight reprieve from the storm's assault. The air was thick with the smell of hay and damp earth. He raised the lantern, its beam cutting through the gloom. The horses shifted nervously in their stalls, their eyes wide with fear. He scanned the barn, his rifle held ready. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "Is anyone there?" Silence. He took a step further, deeper into the barn. Then he saw it, a dark shape huddled in the far corner, nestled amongst the hay bales. He moved closer, his heart pounding in his chest. As he got closer, he saw it was a woman, young, with long, dark hair matted with rain and dirt. She was wrapped in a tattered blanket, shivering uncontrollably. Her eyes, wide and dark as the night sky, stared up at him with a mixture of fear and pain. He noticed the crimson stain blooming on her shoulder, soaking through the blanket. She was Comanche. He knew it in his bones. The high cheekbones, the proud set of her jaw, the intricate beadwork on the remnants of her moccasins. Dusty lowered his rifle, his hand trembling. He hadn't seen a Comanche on his land in years. Tensions had been high, ever since the settlers started pushing further west. But he couldn't just leave her here to die. "Easy," he said softly, his voice rough from disuse. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't speak, but her eyes remained fixed on him, wary and guarded. He knelt down beside her, setting the lantern on the ground. He could see now that she was even younger than he'd first thought, barely more than a girl. "You're hurt," he said, pointing to her shoulder. "I need to take a look." She flinched, drawing the blanket tighter around herself. He could see the fear etched on her face, the distrust in her eyes. He understood. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror. He held up his hands, palms open. "I just want to help," he said. "I'm Dusty. Dusty Rivers." Her lips parted slightly, as if she was about to speak, but no sound came out. He waited, his heart aching for this wounded creature, caught in the storm's fury. He pointed to himself again. "Dusty," he repeated. Then, he pointed to her. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then whispered a single word, so soft he almost missed it. "Moonbeam, a wary trust." Dusty Rivers loomed in the barn's entrance, lamplight etching exaggerated, gaunt shadows from the haystacks. Motionless, the woman lay, a dark bloom staining the shoulder of her doeskin dress. Comanche. The word landed like a cold weight. Decades of grim tales, of brutal raids, gnawed at his resolve. Every fiber urged him to abandon her, to gallop to the fort and report his finding. Let the army handle it. Yet something stayed his hand. The very way she regarded him, pain notwithstanding, not with animosity, but a guarded supplication. And that wound, it looked dire and flamed. Leave her, and she'd be carrion by dawn, ravaged by scavengers. He muttered a curse, the sound devoured by the barn's immensity. He was a fool, a prize fool gambling his safety on the very people who might butcher him in his bed. He advanced deliberately, hands displayed. Not going to hurt you, he rasped, voice rusty from disuse. Just need to see to that wound. He knelt, the odors of blood and turned earth rising. Though still, her sable eyes, deep and bottomless, never broke contact. He sensed her appraisal, judging him, like a raptor eyeing prey. He hoped she saw the truth, a weary soul, hollowed out by solitude, more frightened than menacing. He reached for his canteen, wetting a strip of cloth. Doubt lingered. What if this was a ruse? A snare? He banished the thought. He couldn't simply stand paralyzed by indecision. The cloth touched her skin, cool and damp. She reacted with a subtle clenching of her jaw. He dabbed gingerly, avoiding the ragged perimeter, the livid flesh. Decidedly infected. He needed to cleanse it thoroughly, find that balm his grandmother concocted. He glanced at her face. Her features remained impassive, still vigilant, an enigma. Need to get you inside, he stated. It's freezing out here, and I must clean this correctly. He anticipated a response, a demur, anything. She remained mute, her gaze unwavering. He exhaled. Fine then. He carefully gathered her up, surprised by her lightness. Her frame was tense, like a tightly wound mechanism, primed to react. He bore her inside, the lantern casting spectral shapes on the walls. His home felt diminished with her presence, his refuge trespassed. He settled her on his cot, the sole approximation of comfort he possessed. He rifled through his sparse provisions, locating the jar of salve, a clean dressing. He sat near her, his hands betraying a slight tremor. This might sting, he offered needlessly. He began cleansing the wound, the antiseptic searing the raw tissue. She sucked in a breath, stifling any sound. He toiled silently, brow furrowed. He was no physician, but he knew just enough concerning the treatment of wounds to ensure a person's survival. The quiet lengthened, thick and palpable, punctuated only by the fire's soft crackle. At long last, he finished. He bound the wound, fingers grazing her sleek, warm skin. He avoided her stare. He rose, retreating. There, that's the best I can do. He cleared his throat. I'll prepare some broth. You need sustenance. He turned, but a hand, unexpectedly strong, encircled his wrist. He froze, his pulse racing. He glanced down. Her eyes, still fathomless and intense, contained a glint he couldn't define. Gratitude, perhaps, or merely a fleeting ceasefire in a conflict that had lasted generations. She spoke, voices soft, throaty murmur. A solitary word, barely audible. Moonbeam. He gaped at her, the name suspended between them. Moonbeam. It suited her perfectly. It was a beginning. A small, frail seed of faith planted in arid soil between warring factions. He nodded deliberately. Dusty, he responded. My name is Dusty Rivers. He held her stare, his searching, questioning. Moonbeam. He repeated it, testing its resonance. Rest now, Moonbeam. He gently freed his wrist and turned away, the weight of her name, of her being, settling heavily on his shoulders. He was adrift, without bearing, ignorant of what lay ahead. His only surety was that he couldn't abandon her to perish. And somehow that felt adequate, for the moment. Silent communication. Dusty, down on one knee, offered the tin cup. Moonbeam's dark eyes, clouded by lingering fever dreams, tracked his every move. He dampened a corner of his bandana and dabbed at her cracked lips. She winced, then surrendered to the cool touch. He repeated the gesture, then held out the cup. A long moment passed while she studied him, assessing. Finally, with a hesitant reach, she accepted the offering. Her hand trembled as she brought the cup to her mouth, taking delicate sips. Dusty remained still, his own parched throat forgotten in his concern. When she lowered the cup, their gazes met. A spark ignited within her eyes, something beyond mere apprehension. He offered a shy smile, then gestured towards the simmering stew pot. He mimed stirring and then eating with gusto, hoping to coax her. Her expression remained unreadable, yet he sensed a flicker of comprehension. He ladled a portion, a humble mix of beans and rabbit, into a bowl and presented it. This time, she accepted it without delay. She ate with quiet deliberation, savoring each mouthful. Dusty occupied himself tidying the makeshift camp within the barn, granting her space while maintaining a watchful vigilance. He split wood, the axe biting into the logs with satisfying thuds, then hauled water from the well, the pulley's rusty shriek a constant accompaniment. He caught her observing him, her gaze tracing his movements. Days bled into a pattern. Dusty tended her injuries, provided sustenance, and then performed his chores. Moonbeam, voiceless, absorbed everything, her eyes becoming increasingly eloquent. He attempted simple words, water, sun, eat, but they registered as mere sounds. Her brow furrowed in concentration, a silent puzzle. One afternoon, the sharp keening of steel on stone filled the barn as Dusty honed his knife. Moonbeam sat near the wide doorway, basking in the golden afternoon light. He glanced up to find her gaze fixed on him. An idea took root. Setting the knife aside, he approached her. Upon a smooth patch of earth, he drew a rudimentary rabbit with his finger. He indicated the drawing, then gestured towards the fragrant stew. Moonbeam's eyes widened, surprise blossoming on her face. Her gaze shifted between the dirt sketch and the cooking pot, a slow smile gracing her features. Snapping off a twig, she added her own creation beside his, a sun, depicted as a simple circle radiating lines of light. Dusty pointed to her sun, and then to the vast expanse above. Understanding dawned with a nod. He sketched again, this time the well, its wooden structure simple yet recognizable. She pointed to herself, then mimed the act of drinking. Thirst. He understood. Retrieving water, he watched as she drank, and then drew a horse, adding a playful whinny for effect. A delicate giggle escaped her lips, a sound that surprised and delighted him. They spent the remainder of the afternoon immersed in their earthen canvas. He depicted his farmhouse, his grazing cattle, his loyal dog. She countered with a teepee, a top bough, an arrow, a powerful buffalo. Each illustration served as a stepping stone, bridging the vast canyon of language with silent artistry. As twilight descended, painting long shadows across the barn floor, Dusty drew himself. He tapped the image and spoke, Dusty. Moonbeam hesitated, then pointed to herself, and in a voice barely audible, whispered, Moonbeam. The sound, the first utterance he had heard, resonated through him like a sudden chord. A fragile connection, born from shared artistry and burgeoning understanding, had been established. The long-standing ache of solitude began to dissipate, replaced by a warm ember of hope, mirroring the glow of the setting sun. Whispers of suspicion. The dice's clicking chatter died down, yielding to a deep, resonant grumble that consumed the saloon, spreading like wildfire through dry grass. A solitary cough, quickly joined by another, punctuated the growing tension. Jebediah, the blacksmith, punctuated the silence with a sharp spit of tobacco into the sawdust-filled receptacle. Word is, he drawled, wiping his mouth, Comanches sighted south of the creek, close to River's Place. A wave of disquiet rippled through the room's occupants. The saloon doors swung with a mournful creak, a lonely pulse counting down the seconds until something broke. Fear, Dusty knew, was a potent contagion, especially when mixed with the poison of prejudice. Rivers, a gruff voice challenged from the corner. It was Hank, the cattleman, his face a roadmap of permanent disapproval. That recluse keeps to himself always struck me as peculiar. Peculiar ain't the same as sheltering hostels, a reedy voice chimed in. Silas, the town gossip, never wasted an opportunity to fan the flames of suspicion. My cousin swears he saw smoke signals. Comanche, plain as day. The murmuring intensified, stoked by rot-gut whiskey and long-held resentments. Dusty, cloaked in shadow near the back with his beer, felt a chill climb his spine. He'd been so careful, but whispers like tumbleweeds could cover vast distances. We've got to act, Hank bellowed, slamming a fist that made the bottles jump. Can't have those redskins raiding our homesteads while we're sitting on our hands. What do you propose, Unc? Jebediah asked, his gaze sharp. Search Rivers Ranch, Hank declared, his voice thick with conviction. If there's a Comanche around, he's hiding her. Dusty's grip tightened on the cool glass. He had to reach the ranch. Moonbeam was too weak to even try hiding herself. The saloon hummed with angry energy. Voices rose and fell, fueled by decades of ingrained distrust and old prejudices. Dusty recognized the choreography. He'd witnessed it before. This wasn't about protecting families. It was about dominance, about solidifying an us versus them narrative. He won't take kindly to that, someone mumbled, but the sentiment was lost in the mounting chorus of agreement. Dusty quietly retreated towards the back exit, his boots barely whispering on the aged floorboards. He cast a final glance back. Hank was orchestrating the posse, chest puffed, face flushed with righteous indignation. We ride at dawn, he roared, hoisting his glass. For the safety of our loved ones. Dusty slipped into the cool embrace of the night. The moon was a thin sliver in the black sky, painting elongated, grotesque shadows. Mounting his horse, a hard knot of dread formed in his gut. He had to warn Moonbeam, get her ready. The ride to the ranch was a frantic dash against time. The wind clawed at his face, carrying the sharp scent of sagebrush and the premonition of trouble. He spurred his horse onward, the animal's hooves beating a frantic tattoo against the parched earth. He crashed into the barn, breath rattling in his chest. Moonbeam looked up, eyes wide with apprehension. He cursed the tremble in his voice. He needed to project calm. They're coming, he said, his tone low and urgent. They think I'm sheltering a Comanche. They're going to search the ranch. Moonbeam instinctively touched her wound, her face paling further. We have to conceal you, Dusty said, his mind racing, somewhere they'd never think to look. He swept his gaze across the barn, taking in the hayloft and the deep shadows. Time was bleeding away. The dawn was approaching far too quickly. A dangerous deception. Sweat beaded on Dusty's palms. The reek of pine and iron hung in the air after his hasty bandaging of Moonbeam's worst injuries, abruptly broken by the distant cadence of multiple horses. Not a lone rider, nor even a pair, but a whole damn company. A knot twisted in his stomach. Friendliness wasn't on their agenda. He silenced Moonbeam with a finger to his lips, then slipped out of the barn, easing the door shut. Blinking against the sun's glare, he made out 4 figures atop their mounts at the edge of his land, faces set like granite. He recognized Jed Barlow, a man whose cruelty preceded him like buzzards drawn to carrion. Rivers, Barlow's voice, a rasping croak, cut through the stillness. We're hunting a Comanche woman. Heard she's bleeding bad. Dusty dredged up a composure he didn't possess. You're trespassing, Barlow. What's your concern? Barlow expectorated a brown stream onto the arid ground. Rumor has it, she murdered a man. A decent, Christian man. We aim to see justice done. You aim to harass and make problems, Dusty retorted, his voice gaining an edge. I haven't laid eyes on any Comanche. Now, clear off my property. Barlow's gaze sharpened, dissecting Dusty, calculating. We have reason to think she's holed up here, Rivers. We're searching the premises. He nodded to his companions, their hands hovering above their sidearms. Dusty stood firm, arms crossed, a silent barricade. The air thrummed with menace. You'll violate my ranch only over my corpse, Barlow. A younger cowboy, barely out of his teens, fidgeted in his saddle. "Mr. Barlow, maybe a warrant would be best." Barlow silenced him with a scorching look. "We require no permission when dealing with savages. Now, will you step aside, Rivers, or must we persuade you?" Dusty knew the odds were stacked against him. 1 against 4, and these were men deaf to reason. Yet he wouldn't expose Moonbeam to them. He swallowed hard, buying time. "Wait," he said, raising a hand in supplication. "A woman is here, but you're mistaken about who she is." Barlow's thick brow furrowed in suspicion. "What game are you playing, Rivers?" "She's my cousin," Dusty improvised, the lie tasting like grit in his mouth. "She rode all the way from back east. Terribly unwell. Consumption. That's why she's been secluded." Barlow's eyes, cold as river stones, narrowed further. "Consumption, you say? Let's just peek inside. Ensure she ain't wearing buckskin and feathers." Dusty inhaled deeply. This was the precipice. He turned toward the barn, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He heard the scrape of boots on the parched earth as the cowboys dismounted. He forced open the barn door, its rusty hinges emitting a mournful cry. Moonbeam sat upright, her dark eyes wide with trepidation, a blanket clutched around her. He positioned himself in front of her, a human shield. "See for yourselves," he stated, his voice strained. He stepped aside, revealing Moonbeam in the barn's shadowy interior. She coughed, a parched, rattling sound that seemed to shake her entire frame. She leaned against the wall, her face ashen and gaunt. Dusty held his breath, praying she grasped the charade. Barlow and the others crowded into the barn, their gazes sweeping over Moonbeam. The young cowboy averted his eyes, his expression laced with empathy. "She don't resemble no warrior," one of the cowboys mumbled, scratching his head in bewilderment. Barlow scrutinized Moonbeam for a long, agonizing beat, his gaze lingering on her emaciated form and the shadows beneath her eyes. Finally, he spat on the dirt floor. "Consumption, eh? Keep her isolated, Rivers. Don't want nobody contracting nothing." He pivoted and stalked out of the barn, the others trailing behind him. Dusty watched them mount up and depart, a swirling vortex of dust marking their passage. Once they were gone, he turned back to Moonbeam. Her eyes held a complex tapestry of confusion and gratitude. He knelt beside her, tentatively reaching out to touch her arm. "I had to shield you," he murmured. "I hope you understand." Moonbeam regarded him, her expression inscrutable. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers surprisingly strong, a connection made physical. It was the first time she'd initiated contact, a silent language all its own. Dusty understood he'd crossed a Rubicon, an action with potentially dire consequences. He had lied to protect her, jeopardizing his standing, perhaps even his very existence. Yet, as he met her dark, knowing gaze, he knew he'd make the same choice again, without hesitation. Betrayal and opportunity. The aroma of sage and pine still clung to Dusty as he walked into the Golden Barrel Saloon, the setting sun painting long shadows across the dusty street. He needed supplies, and a strong cup of coffee wouldn't hurt after tending to Moonbeam all day. He hadn't seen hide nor hair of her since he brought her to the barn, but he knew her presence was a risk, a necessary one. Jedstone was already there, a squat, bullish man with eyes that always seemed to be calculating angles. He held court near the pot-bellied stove, his booming laughter echoing across the room as he recounted some exaggerated tale of cattle rustling. Dusty tried to avoid him, but Jed's gaze snagged on him like a burr. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," Jed drawled, the laughter instantly gone from his voice. "Dusty Rivers. Thought you'd be out branding strays, not holed up at that dilapidated ranch of yours." Dusty ignored the bait, ordering his coffee from Maggie, the saloon keeper, whose worn face held a permanent expression of weary amusement. "Heard some mighty peculiar things going on out at your place, Rivers," Jed persisted, his voice carrying to every corner of the saloon. "Folks saying you're harboring something unusual." A knot tightened in Dusty's stomach. He swirled the coffee in his cup, the silence stretching taut. He knew Jed was a viper, always looking for a weakness to exploit. Dusty's isolated ranch, his quiet life. These were weaknesses in Jed's eyes. "Just tending my business, Stone," Dusty replied, his voice low but firm. Jed chuckled, a sound that scraped like gravel. "Business, you say? Business involving redskins?" He let the word hang in the air, heavy with prejudice. A ripple of unease spread through the saloon. Dusty's jaw clenched. He knew the power of fear, the way it could twist reason into a weapon. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," Jed said, his eyes glinting. "A Comanche squaw, wounded and helpless, hidden away in your barn. That's what I hear. A dangerous squaw, no doubt, probably part of some raiding party." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Old man Hemlock, who had lost his son to a Comanche raid years ago, spat on the floor. Jed had planted the seed, and it was already taking root. Dusty set his coffee down, the clink of the cup loud in the sudden silence. "That's a lie, Stone. A lie," Jed scoffed, taking a step closer. "Seems like you're awfully defensive for a man with nothing to hide. Maybe we should all ride out to your ranch and see for ourselves what you're keeping secret." The air in the saloon thickened, charged with hostility. Dusty knew he was outnumbered, outgunned by Jed's influence and the town's ingrained fear. He had to defuse the situation, but how? Later that evening, as the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across his ranch, Jed Stone arrived with a posse of men, their faces grim and determined. They surrounded the barn, their rifles held ready. "Rivers," Jed bellowed, his voice cutting through the night. "Come out here, and bring the Comanche with you." Dusty emerged from the cabin, his shotgun held loosely at his side. He saw the fear in their eyes, the hatred stoked by Jed's lies. "There's no Comanche here, Stone," Dusty said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Don't lie to us, Rivers." Jed snarled. "We know she's here. Hand her over, and we might just let you off with a warning." "She's hurt," Dusty argued. "She needs help." "Help?" Jed laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The only help she needs is a bullet between the eyes. And while we're at it, Rivers, your land is looking mighty prosperous these days. Maybe it's time you moved on. Consider this your final warning. The land remembers." The sun beat down on Dusty's weathered face as he surveyed his land. Moonbeam stood beside him, her dark eyes scanning the horizon, not with a gaze, but a feeling. "The land remembers," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the rustling grass. "It remembers the paths of deer, the flow of water, the intentions of men." Dusty frowned. "Intentions? What do you mean?" "Jed," she stated simply, "he will come again. He desires this land. He will try to take it." She pointed to a seemingly innocuous gully running along the western edge of the property. "This is a weakness. Men can hide here, approach unseen." Dusty had always considered that gully a natural drain, nothing more. He squinted, trying to see it with Moonbeam's eyes. He saw only earth and scrub. "I don't understand," he admitted. Moonbeam moved with a fluid grace that belied her recent injuries. She knelt, running her fingers through the dry soil. "The earth tells a story. See these broken twigs? Not broken by wind, broken by a clumsy foot. And here," she pointed to a faint depression in the ground, "a print, a heavy boot. 2 men, perhaps 3, have used this gully recently." Dusty felt a knot tighten in his gut. He'd been so focused on tending to Moonbeam that he'd neglected his own defenses. "What can we do?" "We listen to the land," Moonbeam replied, rising to her feet. "We learn its secrets. We become as ghosts, seeing without being seen." For the next few days, Moonbeam taught Dusty to read the subtle language of the land. She showed him how to track, not just by following footprints, but by observing the disturbed patterns of grass, the direction of broken branches, the faint scent of wood smoke on the breeze. He learned to distinguish the calls of different birds, understanding that a sudden silence could signal danger. Dusty, a man of action, found the patience required frustrating at first. But as he began to see the world through Moonbeam's eyes, a new awareness blossomed within him. He discovered a connection to his land he'd never known existed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Moonbeam tensed. "They are coming," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Tonight." Dusty felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about protecting Moonbeam, about defending the trust that had grown between them. He had already reinforced the barn doors and windows, following Moonbeam's suggestions. They had created diversions, trails that led away from the ranch, designed to mislead their pursuers. Now, he grabbed his rifle and checked the ammunition. "Stay here," he said to Moonbeam. She shook her head. "I will not hide. I will fight beside you." They positioned themselves in the shadows of the barn, overlooking the gully. The night grew quiet, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Then a twig snapped. Dusty raised his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw them emerge from the gully, 3 figures cloaked in darkness. Jed and 2 of his men. Dusty fired a warning shot into the air. "Get off my land, Jed." Jed laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed across the stillness. "This land will be mine, Rivers. One way or another." The fight erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. Dusty and Moonbeam worked in perfect synchronicity, using the shadows and terrain to their advantage. Moonbeam, surprisingly adept with a rifle, picked off one of Jed's men as he tried to flank them. Dusty focused on Jed, his eyes narrowed with determination. He fired again, and Jed stumbled, clutching his arm. "Damn you, Rivers!" Jed roared, and signaled his remaining man to retreat. They disappeared back into the gully, swallowed by the darkness. Dusty watched them go, his rifle still raised. He knew this wasn't over. Joe'd be back. But tonight they had won. He lowered his rifle and turned to Moonbeam. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes shone with a fierce pride. "We fought well," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. Dusty nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "We did." He felt a bond between them, forged in the heat of battle, stronger than anything he had ever known. He looked out at his land, no longer seeing just fields and fences, but a living, breathing entity, a silent partner in their struggle. The land remembered, and so would he. Chayton's fury, the dust boiling on the horizon, wasn't the languid rise of grazing cattle. It was retribution incarnate, a mounted war party surging across the prairie like a crimson tide. Rivers shaded his eyes, the breakfast fire's scent turning sharp and bitter, a premonition confirmed. He'd suspected this reckoning since he began tending Moonbeam's wounds. The silent advance felt heavy with threat. Perhaps 20 painted faces, ochre and ebony swirling into terrifying masks, lances glinting like shards of fallen sunlight. At their fore, a man radiating raw power upon a midnight black steed. Chayton, Moonbeam's brother. Rivers set aside the empty stew bowl. He had recently changed her poultice, the inflamed gash appearing less virulent. His hopes were pinned on Parley. "Stay put," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. He placed the shotgun, mercifully empty, within her reach, just in case of trouble. He strode out to meet them, boots stirring little eddies of parched soil. His rifle remained on the porch, a deliberate signal of peaceful intent. 100 yards out, the war band ground to a halt, Chayton urging his mount forward with a subtle shift of weight. He was a towering figure, muscle etched beneath tan buckskin. His dark eyes pierced Rivers like shards of obsidian. "You!" Chayton's voice resonated, a guttural rumble that defied the distance. "Where is she?" Rivers stood firm. "She's here. She was injured. I aided her." Chayton's lip curled in a sneer. "Aided?" Li's pale face. "Abducted, more like. You violated her." "That's untrue," Rivers replied, his tone unwavering. "She was at death's door when I found her. Inside. I cleansed the wound, fed her, guarded her." He indicated the cabin. "See for yourself." He held aloft the discarded bandages, stained crimson. "Evidence of my care." A restless murmur swept through the warriors. Chayton was unmoved, eyes glacial. "Show me." Rivers turned, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and headed for the cabin. A quick glance revealed Chayton following, his warriors spreading out, a silent encirclement. Rivers shoved open the door. Moonbeam pushed herself upright, her eyes widening as she recognized Chayton. A shadow of relief, quickly overtaken by apprehension, flickered across her features. Chayton brushed past Rivers, his gaze assessing Moonbeam's condition. He knelt beside her, speaking in rapid-fire Comanche. Rivers understood nothing of the words, but grasped the sentiment, concern, relief, transitioning into sharp interrogation. Moonbeam responded, her voice a mere thread. She indicated Rivers with a gesture. Chayton swiveled back, his expression an inscrutable mask. Moonbeam then spoke again, louder, her voice ringing with certainty. She pointed to the bandage on her arm, her gaze fixed on Chayton. He listened intently, the earlier fury leaching from his face, replaced by a slow dawn of realization. He rose, his eyes meeting Rivers. She claims you assisted her, Chayton stated, his voice still rough-edged but the venom gone. She says you preserved her life. Rivers inclined his head. I acted with simple humanity. Chayton scrutinized him, a prolonged, unwavering stare. He then offered a slight inclination of his head. I offer thanks then for your mercy. But be warned, he added, the menace returning, should you have caused her harm, you will answer for it. A pregnant pause. He turned back to Moonbeam, murmuring softly in her native tongue. With a fluid motion, he lifted her into his arms. He emerged from the cabin, the warriors opening their ranks. He mounted the stallion, Moonbeam cradled securely. He glanced back at Rivers, a fleeting expression, perhaps gratitude, glinting in his gaze. Then, with a piercing cry, he spun his horse, and the war party followed, dissolving once more into the ochre haze, leaving Rivers in a heavy, expectant quiet. A bridge of understanding. The arrow had pierced her thigh, high enough that Dusty knew he couldn't dig it out himself. The blood had slowed to a trickle, but the pallor of her skin worried him. He'd cleaned the wound as best he could with water and a clean rag, whispering reassurances in a language she couldn't understand. He needed a doctor, but dragging her to town was a death sentence. He sat beside her makeshift bed of hay, watching her shallow breaths. The barn door creaked, and he turned, hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the wall. Silhouetted against the setting sun stood a group of Comanche warriors, their faces grim. At their head was a man who held himself with a quiet authority. Chayton. Dusty recognized him from glimpses he'd caught in town, the leader of the band that sometimes traded there. He braced himself. This was it. Chayton stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over Dusty, then settling on the woman in the hay. He spoke in Comanche, his voice low and sharp. Dusty didn't understand the words, but he understood the intent. Accusation. She is wounded, Dusty said, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. I found her like this. I am trying to help. Chayton's eyes narrowed. He barked another order, and one of the warriors dismounted, approaching the woman cautiously. He examined her wound, then spoke to Chayton, his voice softer this time. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustling of the wind in the eaves of the barn. Finally, Chayton dismounted as well. He walked slowly towards Dusty, stopping just a few feet away. Why? He asked, the single word rough with suspicion. Dusty swallowed. Because she is a person. Because she needed help. He gestured to the wound. She needs a doctor. I don't know how to help her more. Chayton stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, to Dusty's surprise, a flicker of something akin to understanding crossed his face. He spoke a few words to his warriors, then turned back to Dusty. My people have medicine, he said, his English halting but clear. We will help her. Dusty let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Thank you, he said, the sincerity in his voice thick. Over the next few days, the Comanches tended to the woman, whose name Dusty learned was Moonbeam. They brought herbs and poultices, and Chayton himself oversaw her care. Dusty, in turn, provided them with food and water and a place to rest. He learned their names, their customs, their stories, one laborious phrase at a time. Moonbeam, once she was strong enough, became their translator. She spoke both Comanche and a little broken English, enough to bridge the gap between them. Dusty found himself sharing stories of his life on the ranch, of his loneliness, of his dreams. He learned about the Comanche way of life, their deep connection to the land, their respect for the spirits. One evening, sitting around a crackling fire, Moonbeam pointed to the stars. "Your people, they see patterns," she said. "Constellations. My people, we see stories. The Great Bear, the Hunter, the Lost Maiden." Dusty, looking up at the same sky he'd stared at for years, saw it with new eyes. He began to understand that their differences weren't weaknesses, but strengths, that their different perspectives could enrich each other. He decided to start teaching the children of the ranch hands how to read and write, Moonbeam translating his lessons into Comanche. In turn, Moonbeam taught the children Comanche crafts, the intricate beadwork, and the making of moccasins. Word of their unusual partnership spread. At first, there was suspicion and fear. Some of the townsfolk whispered about Dusty gone native, about the dangers of fraternizing with the savages. But others, drawn by curiosity and a yearning for something more than the endless cycle of conflict, began to come to the ranch. They came to learn, to listen, to see for themselves. Old prejudices began to crumble. The children, especially, embraced the new knowledge with open hearts. They saw each other not as enemies, but as friends. Slowly, tentatively, a community began to emerge, built on respect and understanding. It was a fragile thing, easily broken, but it was growing, nurtured by the unlikely friendship between a lonely rancher and a wounded Comanche woman. The bridge between their worlds was still under construction, but with each shared story, with each act of kindness, it grew stronger. Dusty looked to the horizon, seeing not just the endless plains, but the limitless possibilities of a future where two worlds could coexist and perhaps even thrive.